April 7th, 1945. On the expansive, uncluttered bridge of the super-battleship Yamato, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito stood as a statue in the heart of a steel leviathan. His one good hand, a permanent reminder of naval combat's unforgiving nature, rested on the polished brass of the compass housing. Below his feet, 72,000 tons of meticulously crafted steel vibrated with the contained fury of 150,000 horsepower engines, pushing the colossal vessel through the grey, indifferent waters of the East China Sea. The intelligence report he had reviewed in the pre-dawn gloom of the Bungo Channel was less a military document and more a formal invitation to oblivion. American carrier aircraft, not dozens but hundreds, were converging on their position like vultures sensing a kill. There would be no Japanese air cover, a fact that stripped the mission of any pretense of military logic. Operation Tengo, known poetically and tragically as Kikusui or Floating Chrysanthemum, was a final, glorious and utterly hopeless roll of the dice, a one-way voyage to Okinawa. The plan, if it could be called that, was to beach the Yamato and fight as an unsinkable shore battery until her last shell was fired and her last man was dead. Ito gazed at the faces of his young officers, their expressions a mixture of fatalistic resolve and unwavering faith in the machine they commanded. To them, this ship was not merely a weapon of war, it was a god made of steel, the physical embodiment of the Japanese Empire's divine spirit. They truly believed it was impervious to the swarms of fragile, insignificant insects the Americans would send against them. For 4 long years, the Yamato had been the Imperial Japanese Navy's ultimate trump card, a weapon so powerful and so precious that its very existence was one of the nation's most closely guarded state secrets. It spent most of the war at anchor in Truk or Kure, a formidable presence that rarely fired its guns, earning the cynical nickname Hotel Yamato from sailors in the rest of the fleet who were engaged in constant brutal combat. Its legendary 18.1-inch guns, capable of hurling an armor-piercing shell, the weight of a small automobile over 25 miles, were meant to be the final arbiters of the one decisive battle that would annihilate the American fleet and secure Japanese naval supremacy for a generation. What Admiral Ito knew in his soul, and what the high priest of the Kantai Kessen doctrine in Tokyo had refused to accept, was that the decisive battle had already been fought and lost, not by ships dueling on the high seas, but by competing industrial and technological systems. The Yamato's final voyage was not a battle. It was a ritual sacrifice on the altar of a dead philosophy. The very perfection that had created this magnificent beast was about to be systematically dismantled by an opposing philosophy, one embodied by a vessel the Yamato's designers would have considered a mere escort, a footnote in a naval register, the Fletcher-class destroyer. These small, unassuming, mass-produced ships, 175 of them sliding off American assembly lines, represented a new and far more ruthless kind of naval power. They, along with the carrier aircraft they screened with a curtain of steel, would prove that the age of the battleship was over. The cold mathematics of naval supremacy, once measured in armor thickness and gun caliber, were about to be rewritten by radar pings, logistical chains, and the relentless calculus of industrial production. Within 6 hours, the very officers now preparing for a final, glorious gun battle would be struggling for their lives in oily, burning water, their steel god torn apart by an enemy they could barely see, an enemy that fought not like a samurai warrior, but like an engineer methodically disassembling an obsolete machine. The pinnacle of naval scripture, the confidence of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the euphoric early months of 1942 was not the product of arrogance, but of a string of victories so stunning they seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare. Since the devastating strike on December 7th, 1941, the rising sun had blazed across the Pacific. At Pearl Harbor, they had sent the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battle line to the bottom of the harbor. Days later, in a demonstration that should have been a dire warning to battleship purists, land-based Japanese bombers sank the modern British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse at sea, In the Battle of the Java Sea, a cobbled-together Allied fleet of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships was utterly annihilated. The Japanese combined fleet, with its superior torpedoes, well-drilled night-fighting tactics, and aggressive spirit, seemed invincible. At the heart of this victorious doctrine was the concept of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. This philosophy was a near-religious obsession, born from the Navy's defining moment, the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where Admiral Togo's fleet had destroyed the Russian fleet and secured victory in the Russo-Japanese War. For the next 4 decades, the entire structure, training, and shipbuilding program of the IJN was geared towards refighting that one perfect battle. A single, cataclysmic engagement where a qualitatively superior Japanese fleet would destroy its numerically superior American counterpart. And the Yamato, along with its sister ship Musashi, was to be the ultimate expression of that doctrine. The secrecy surrounding its construction was legendary. It was built in a specially deepened dry dock at the Kure Naval Arsenal, a dry dock that was completely shielded from prying eyes by a massive roof woven from sisal mats to prevent any chance of aerial reconnaissance. The thousands of workers involved were sworn to absolute secrecy under penalty of death, and the ship's true specifications were hidden even from most of the IJN's own officers. Its main armament was publicly referred to as 40-centimeter or 15.7-inch guns, to cleverly conceal their actual monstrous 46-centimeter or 18.1-inch dimension. When the ship was finally launched in 1940, the few naval attachés who gleaned whispers of its existence refused to believe the rumored specifications. A standard displacement of 65,000 tons, swelling to over 72,000 when fully loaded, 3 times the size of a heavy cruiser. An armor belt of 16.1 inches of hardened steel, angled at 20 degrees to increase its effective thickness, designed to be immune to any naval shell in existence at expected battle ranges. Its deck armor, over 8 inches thick, was meant to defeat plunging fire and bombs. The ship was a fortress. Captain Kamoto Kurashima, a senior planning officer on Admiral Yamamoto's staff, known for his brilliant but often reckless ideas, perfectly articulated the philosophy behind the ship. The Yamato is not a ship, he wrote in his private papers. It is the physical manifestation of the Japanese spirit. It is precise, powerful, and beautiful. The American approach is to build many crude, ugly ships. They believe quantity has a quality all its own. We will prove that one perfect sword in the hands of a master is superior to 1,000 clumsy clubs. The Yamato's perfection was achieved through an uncompromising, almost artisanal commitment to quality. Its optical rangefinders were the largest in the world, with a baseline of 15 meters, so precise they could supposedly spot the fall of shells over 20 miles away with uncanny accuracy. Its hull was designed with a unique bulbous bow that reduced hydrodynamic drag, increasing both its speed and its fuel efficiency. The ship's internal layout featured over 1,100 watertight compartments designed to contain any damage. The living quarters for its nearly 3,000-man crew were Spartan, but critical areas like the plotting rooms and magazines were air-conditioned, an unheard-of luxury. This obsession with creating a single perfect weapon, however, was blinding the combined fleet to the new reality of naval warfare. A reality being defined not in gunnery ranges, but on factory floors and in radar laboratories across the vast expanse of America. The dismissal of the system. The first detailed intelligence reports on American shipbuilding capacity began to reach the Naval General Staff in Tokyo in mid-1942. The numbers presented were so astronomical they were initially dismissed as blatant propaganda, a clumsy American attempt at psychological warfare. The reports spoke of new destroyer classes, specifically the Fletcher-class, being laid down in assembly line fashion in dozens of shipyards simultaneously. To the Japanese naval architects who reviewed them, the specifications for these ships seemed utterly unimpressive. They displaced just over 2,000 tons, a fraction of a Japanese cruiser. Their main armament consisted of 5 dual-purpose 5-inch guns, capable of engaging both surface targets and aircraft. Their armor was paper-thin, just over half an inch on the hull, enough to stop shell splinters but not a serious projectile. They were, in the meticulous eyes of Japanese designers, simply adequate, a mass-produced commodity. Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's chief of staff, a man whose detailed diary provides a priceless window into the IJN's mindset, captured the prevailing contempt. The Americans boast of building 100 destroyers. What is 100 destroyers to a ship like Yamato? They are like a pack of yapping dogs barking at a tiger. The Yamato's secondary battery of 6-inch guns alone could sink a dozen of them before they get within torpedo range. Their strategy is one of brute force and numbers, a continuation of their failed land-based philosophy. They do not understand the aesthetics, the soul of naval combat. The on-paper mathematics of a traditional gun duel appeared to validate this disdain. The Yamato's main guns had a maximum range of 42,000 meters, nearly 26 miles. A Fletcher's 5-inch guns had a maximum effective range of about 16,000 meters, less than 10 miles. Japanese intelligence had noted the presence of the Mark 37 gunfire control system on the Fletcher, a system that integrated data from the ship's new SG surface search radar. But its revolutionary impact was completely misunderstood. They viewed it as a heavy, overly complex gadget, a crutch for poorly trained gunners who lacked the almost mystical skill of Japanese optical rangefinder operators. In a clear-weather daylight engagement, the scenario that formed the basis for all Japanese naval doctrine, the Yamato could methodically destroy an entire squadron of Fletchers before its own pristine paint was even scratched. The Japanese failed to appreciate the Fletcher's design philosophy. It wasn't meant to be a duelist. It was a node in a network. Its 5 boilers and twin engines gave it speed, and more importantly, redundancy. It could take a hit and keep fighting. Its versatility was its greatest strength. Equipped not just with guns and torpedoes, but also extensive depth charge racks for anti-submarine warfare and a forest of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns that grew denser as the war progressed. The Japanese believed the war would be won in a single glorious afternoon of decisive combat. The Americans were preparing to win it over 3 years of grinding, systematic 24-hour-a-day attrition. The first brutal lesson in this new math was about to be taught, not by a battleship, but by the very tin-can destroyers the IJN held in such utter contempt. The charge of the Light Brigade. October 25, 1944. The waters off the island of Samar in the Philippines. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded Center Force, the most powerful surface fleet assembled in the Pacific War, with the mighty Yamato as its flagship. His mission was to transit the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the vulnerable American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Through a complex series of miscalculations and American command errors, he had emerged from the strait to find his path blocked by nothing more than a tiny, comically outmatched American task unit, codenamed Taffy 3. It consisted of 6 small, slow escort carriers, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. From the Yamato's towering bridge, the American force looked like a collection of bathtub toys. Lieutenant Commander Kikuo Tanaka, Yamato's gunnery officer, recorded his initial reaction in his battle report. Victory was not just certain, it was going to be effortless. We had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers. They had tin cans. We prepared to engage with main armament. The standard doctrine for the hopelessly outgunned American force was to turn and flee, hoping to save the priceless carriers. Instead, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague gave an order that must have seemed like sheer insanity to the Japanese observers. He ordered his destroyers to attack the Japanese line. The USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer commanded by the legendary, famously pugnacious Ernest E. Evans, turned directly toward the charging Japanese fleet. It charged the Yamato. The Johnston was a 2,100-ton ship attacking a 72,000-ton behemoth. It was a David and Goliath scenario, a medieval cavalry charge against a line of fortresses. Evans's strategy was not to sink the Yamato, an impossible task. His goal was to disrupt, to distract, to throw the meticulous Japanese fire control solutions into chaos, and to buy precious time for his carriers to launch their aircraft. The Johnston laid a thick smokescreen, a simple but devastatingly effective countermeasure that blinded the superb Japanese optical rangefinders. It weaved and dodged, firing its 5-inch guns, the shells sparking harmlessly off Yamato's thick hide like pebbles. Then, it closed to within 10,000 yards, well inside the Yamato's main gun minimum range, and launched its full spread of 10 torpedoes. The attack forced Admiral Kurita to turn the Yamato sharply away to avoid the torpedoes, taking his flagship, the centerpiece of his fleet, out of the fight for a critical 10 minutes. As the Johnston retired, it was joined by the other destroyers, the USS Howell and USS Herman, who made their own suicidal torpedo runs. The Japanese gunners, trained for deliberate long-range fire against other battleships, were completely confounded by the chaotic, close-range melee. They were fighting a pack of rabid wolves, not a fleet. The ferocity of the American destroyers, combined with relentless air attacks from the escort carriers' planes, pilots dropping whatever they had, from small bombs to depth charges, sowed utter confusion in the Japanese command. Kurita, isolated and receiving conflicting reports, became convinced that he was facing a much larger, more powerful American fleet. He believed he had stumbled into a trap laid by Admiral Halsey's main carrier force. Shaken and with his formation in disarray, he made a decision that has been debated by historians ever since. He turned his entire fleet around and retreated. A handful of destroyers and escort carriers had turned back the most powerful battleship fleet on the planet. They had not done it by being stronger. They had done it by being smarter, more coordinated, and suicidally brave. They had demonstrated that the American system of integrated warfare could defeat a vastly superior force that relied on individual ship-on-ship prowess. The soul of naval combat had just been ripped out by a radio, a smokescreen, and a handful of torpedoes. The production abyss. December 1944. The Kure Naval Arsenal in Japan. This was the birthplace of the Yamato, a place of immense national pride. But by late 1944, it was a shadow of its former self, crippled by the American submarine blockade that was strangling the home islands. There were critical shortages of steel, of oil, of aluminum, of skilled labor. Japan would complete only 2 Yamato-class battleships and a third converted to an aircraft carrier during the entire war. In that same period, American shipyards performed an industrial miracle that was a weapon in its own right. Facilities like the Bath Iron Works in Maine and the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in New Jersey operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Using revolutionary modular construction techniques, where massive sections of a ship were built miles inland and then transported to the shipyard for final assembly like giant Lego pieces, they launched a new Fletcher-class destroyer on average every 10 days. A total of 175 were built. The disparity was not just in numbers, but in philosophy. The Japanese sought to build a handful of perfect, irreplaceable ships. The Americans built hundreds of excellent, expendable ships. When a Fletcher-class destroyer was sunk, it was a tragedy for its crew, but a minor strategic setback for the US Navy. The loss of the Yamato or its sister ship, the Musashi, would be a national catastrophe, a wound to the Japanese psyche from which the IJN could not recover. The technological gap was also widening into a chasm. While Japanese lookouts, with their famously excellent eyesight, strained to spot enemy ships, the Americans were perfecting the Combat Information Center, or CIC. On a Fletcher, the CIC was the ship's electronic brain. In a darkened room, shielded from the chaos of the bridge, operators watched the glowing screens of air search and surface search radars. Their pings revealed enemy ships and planes long before they were visible to the naked eye, and could see through darkness, fog, and rain. This data was plotted in real time on a large plexiglass board, creating a complete, instantaneous picture of the battlefield. This gave even a lowly destroyer commander a level of situational awareness that a Japanese admiral on the bridge of the Yamato, relying on binoculars and signal flags, could only dream of. This system-based approach extended to damage control. American sailors were relentlessly drilled in firefighting and patching hull breaches. Their ships were designed with multiple redundant systems, from boilers to electrical generators. Japanese ships, built with an emphasis on offensive power and speed, were notoriously fragile when damaged, their lack of robust damage control becoming a recurring tragedy. This was the industrialization of naval warfare, and Japan, with its smaller craft-based economy, was being buried by it. The Great Turkey Shoot of the Seas. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the larger context for the heroic action off Samar, was the ultimate expression of this systemic annihilation. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed virtually all of its remaining surface units to a complex, three-pronged, desperate plan called Shogo 1. It was their final all-or-nothing attempt at a Kantai Kessen. The American response was overwhelming. The US 3rd and 7th Fleets, a massive armada with a combined total of over 30 aircraft carriers and hundreds of warships, met the separate Japanese forces. On October 24th, in the Sibuyan Sea, the Yamato's sister ship, the Musashi, was attacked by wave after wave of American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38. For 5 brutal hours, the great ship absorbed punishment that defied belief, reinforcing the Japanese myth of its invincibility. But the assault was relentless, and more importantly, methodical. American pilots, coordinating their attacks by radio, concentrated torpedo hits on one side of the ship to induce a fatal list that would eventually overwhelm its ability to counter-flood. Bombers targeted the anti-aircraft batteries to clear the way for the torpedo planes. Finally, after being struck by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 heavy bombs, the Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. It was a terrifying preview of Yamato's own fate. The battleship, the supposed queen of the seas, had been proven utterly helpless against massed, coordinated air power. The entire Shogo plan collapsed into a catastrophic defeat, resulting in the effective destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a coherent fighting force. The psychological reversal. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf created a sense of profound, terminal despair within the Japanese high command. Their finest ships, their most skilled and experienced crews, their most brilliant and complex plans, all had been shattered by the sheer material and organizational superiority of the Americans. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his stark post-battle analysis, "We have been defeated, not by the enemy's tactics, but by his science and his productive capacity. We are like a master swordsman who has brought his finest blade to a battle against an army with rifles." This despair led directly to the full-scale, institutionalized implementation of suicide tactics. The Kamikaze Corps, formally established during the Leyte campaign by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, was the ultimate admission that Japan could no longer compete on a conventional level. Onishi's justification was cold, brutal mathematics. If a pilot in a Zero had a near-zero chance of penetrating the American fleet's defensive screen of Hellcat fighters, and the radar-directed anti-aircraft fire from ships like the Fletchers, then perhaps by turning the entire aircraft into a guided missile, he could succeed. It was the same grim logic, the same embrace of death in the face of unwinnable odds, that would send the Yamato on its final hopeless mission. The final charge, April 6th, 1945. The Yamato, accompanied by the light cruiser Yehigi and 8 destroyers, steamed out of Japan's inland sea. It had only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. The mood among the crew was somber. They knew they were not expected to return. The mission was a gesture, not a strategy. The American submarine USS Threadfin spotted the force almost immediately and radioed its position and course. The trap was set. The next morning, the systematic destruction began. Task Force 58, commanded by the brilliant and ruthless Admiral Mark Mitcher, launched its first wave of aircraft at 10 o'clock in the morning. Nearly 400 planes, Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers were vectored onto the Yamato's position. The Japanese force had no air cover of its own. It was a lamb being led to the slaughter. The American attack was a textbook example of their terrifyingly efficient systemic approach to warfare. The Hellcats went in first, strafing the Yamato's decks with their 50 caliber machine guns. Their goal was not to sink the ship, but to suppress the hundreds of exposed anti-aircraft gunners, to sweep the decks clear of human resistance. Then came the bombers. The Avengers, executing a coordinated anvil attack by approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to divide the anti-aircraft fire and make evasion impossible, dropped their torpedoes. The Helldivers plunged from high altitude, aiming their 1,000-pound bombs at the ship's bridges and massive gun turrets. The ship's commander of anti-aircraft fire, a young officer named Naoyoshi Ishida, later described the onslaught. It was not a battle, it was a storm. The sky was black with American planes. They were like insects, relentless and without number. For every one we shot down, 10 more appeared. Our gun barrels grew hot and then melted. We were blind, deaf, and helpless. The American pilots followed a deliberate clinical plan. Most of the torpedoes were aimed at the port side to create a severe list from which the ship could not recover. The Yamato shuddered under repeated blows. Bombs tore through its upper decks. Torpedoes ripped open its hull. After 2 hours of relentless punishment, having absorbed at least 11 torpedoes and 6 heavy bombs, the order was given to abandon ship. As the giant battleship began to capsize, its list increasing past 90 degrees, a massive internal explosion in one of its main magazines tore the vessel in half, sending up a horrifying mushroom cloud that was seen for 100 miles. The greatest battleship in history was gone. Of its crew of over 3,300 men, fewer than 300 survived. The judgment of history. In the years following the war, American and Japanese naval officers met to discuss the conflict with the clarity of hindsight. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most famous and skilled destroyer commanders and a rare survivor of the war's attrition, wrote extensively about the IJN's failures. His conclusion was damning. We of the Imperial Navy, and especially those on the general staff, were mesmerized by the allure of the big ship, the big gun. We believed in the single, decisive blow. The Americans believed in logistics and attrition. They were right, and we were wrong. The Yamato was the most magnificent folly in naval history. Post-war analysis revealed the true extent of the systemic gap. The Yamato had fired its legendary 18.1-inch guns in anger only once during the Battle off Samar and failed to score a single definitive hit on an enemy warship. In contrast, the Fletcher-class destroyers with their inadequate 5-inch guns had participated in virtually every major naval engagement of the war, sinking submarines, shooting down hundreds of aircraft, bombarding shores, and fighting and winning surface actions against larger and more powerful Japanese ships. The ultimate reckoning. The dominance of the American system can be reduced to the same brutal mathematics that defined the air and land wars. Yamato-class battleships produced 2, Fletcher-class destroyers produced 175. Main gun shells fired by Yamato at enemy warships in its entire career, a few dozen. Torpedoes launched by the USS Johnston in a single 30-minute action. 10. Hours required to build one Yamato, over 7 million. Number of destroyers that could be built for the same cost and materials, at least 15. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, provided the most honest epitaph for the IJN's philosophy. We laughed at the simple, unglamorous American destroyers because we didn't understand that they represented not just a ship, but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our fleet had ceased to exist. The last word. Admiral Seiichi Ito went down with his ship, choosing to tie himself to the pinnacle on the bridge as the Yamato rolled over. He was the last commander of the world's greatest battleship. A warrior of an old school who was consumed by a new era of warfare he could not defeat. The Yamato entered service as the embodiment of a naval philosophy that prized the perfect weapon above all else. It carried guns the Americans couldn't match, was protected by armor they couldn't pierce in a surface engagement, and was crewed by sailors of incredible, unyielding bravery. Japanese admirals had celebrated it because they failed to understand that every extra inch of armor, every extra millimeter of gun caliber, represented not strength, but a fatal strategic miscalculation that their industrial base could not sustain. By the time they understood, their confidence had turned to desperation, their decisive battle doctrine to suicide missions, their magnificent fleet to an artificial reef at the bottom of the East China Sea. The American system, embodied by the humble, ubiquitous, and utterly relentless Fletcher-class destroyer, had not just defeated the Yamato, it had sunk an entire philosophy of warfare, proving that in modern combat, the nation that can build the better fleet will always destroy the nation that can only build the better ship. The architects of the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed their Yamato was invincible. The relentless mathematics of total war had the last laugh. It always did.